Welcome to all, and thank you for making the time to join our webinar today on navigating technology use across childhood and adolescence, supporting healthy development and well-being, presented by Dr. Natasha Parent. My name is Nisha Parker, and I'm a project manager at BC Children's Kelty Mental Health Resource Center. Before we begin, I'd like to start by respectfully and gratefully acknowledging that the Kelty Mental Health Resource Center is located on the unceded, traditional, and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Before we start our presentation, I'd just like to take a moment to share with you a little bit about the Kelty Center and the services that we offer. We are a provincial mental health and substance use resource center for parents and caregivers of children and youth up to age 24. We help families across the province by helping them to navigate the mental health system. We also offer peer support from trained Family Smart peer support workers. And we also connect families to free resources and tools, including our Where You Are podcast, webinars, and more, all of which you can find on our website, keltymentalhealth.ca. And my colleague will put this in the chat as well. Our webinar today is also presented in collaboration with the Health Promotion and Schools team at BC Children's Hospital. Their work focuses on enhancing system-wide changes in school communities that support student mental health and well-being, which they do through coaching, resource development, and professional learning opportunities like this webinar. For more information, you can visit keltymentalhealth.ca/school-professionals, and my colleague will also include that in the chat. And just a few housekeeping notes as well. Attendees are automatically muted and cameras are turned off. For questions today, we'll have a dedicated Q&A session after the main presentation. Please submit any questions you have for the speaker through the Q&A function. And there has also been an option enabled where you can vote for questions that you want answered. If you are having any technical issues, for example, issues with sound, please submit these through the chat function, and my colleague in the background will support you with that. At the end of the webinar, a survey will pop up that we invite you to complete. This really helps us to improve our future webinars at the Kelty Center, so we really appreciate if you could fill that out. And this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our website at keltymentalhealth.ca/events. The link is also in the chat, and we will email you the link to the recording once it's available. And finally, please note that the information in today's webinar applies to the context of British Columbia. If you are in another jurisdiction, please consult your local health authorities for further information that might be more specific to you. And now to introduce our speaker, Dr. Natasha Parent. Dr. Natasha Parent is an adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia and an evaluation lead for BC Emergency Health Services. She brings expertise in developmental psychology and public health, with deep content knowledge on smartphone engagement and well-being in adolescence. She is well published in this area with 16 journal articles and 29 conference presentations, and is regularly invited to present on these topics. Thank you so much, Dr. Natasha Parent, for being here, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Nisha, for that introduction. Hello, everyone. Before we jump into our topic today, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge with gratitude that I'm calling in today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, where I humbly get to live, learn, work, and play as an uninvited guest. In this virtual space, I invite you all to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territories from which you are also joining us today. Okay, so let's talk about navigating technology use across childhood and adolescence. Just to situate us and this conversation, I really want to start by reminding us that technology use is truly an integral part of modern day life. For many of us, our personal devices are the first thing that we look at in the morning and the last thing that we see at night. These technologies are so ingrained in our way of living that most of us spend our days within arm's reach of our smartphones. And we find ourselves habitually checking our devices, even in the absence of a new notification. Given this, and as I'm sure you would agree is quite obvious contemporarily, technology use truly provides an important context for child and adolescent development today. As youth continue to spend an increasing amount of time online, many key developmental tasks are increasingly taking place in these online environments. When we look at child tech use more specifically, we see that most teens in Canada actually own a smartphone. A survey by Media Smarts, which was conducted in 2021, found that 93% of teens ages 14 to 17 owned a smartphone. And I would argue that this number is probably even higher today. The same survey found that half of teens said that they received their first smartphone between the ages of 11 and 13, with 61% indicating that they were given a phone so that their parents could keep in touch with them. In a recent study that I conducted with my colleagues at the University of British Columbia, we found that just over half of teens in British Columbia say that they are online most or all of the time. And really, this makes sense when we consider all of the things that teens can do and access when they're online. They can access maps, they can use digital cameras, read books, look up encyclopedias, listen to music, access their friends, and do their homework. And in many ways, in 2024, these devices truly contain our lives. Alongside this widespread use of technology among teens and children and adults, there's been increasing concerns about the impacts of tech use in terms of youth's mental health and well-being. This has led to what we call a moral panic around screen time and technology use. Moral panic is when there is a widespread belief that something evil is threatening the well-being of society. And in the case of the moral panic around screens and screen time, it refers to a belief that screens are inherently bad and damaging for children and youth. This belief is extremely widespread. You can find it in the media, among educators who worry about how screens are impacting students' learning, among parents who fear their teens are spending too much time online, and among policymakers who try to limit and control when, where, and how teens can use technology. So, as you can see, this deeply rooted moral panic impacts the way that we think about screens as a society and the ways that we talk about technology. And in fact, it's very likely the reason that you decided to join this webinar today. So this moral panic is extremely widespread. And honestly, in many ways, it's well warranted, as the amount of time that kids are spending online, even if in some cases it's developmentally appropriate, it just seems unhealthy to us. We worry that kids are missing out on other key experiences. But what we forget is that children have always inhabited worlds that seem foreign and fearful to their parents. The world of smartphones and social media is a great example of this. It's unsettling and unfamiliar to those who didn't grow up with it. And this moral panic around screens really plays on that fear and that discomfort. So building on this, in today's webinar, we're going to dive into the research to unpack some of youth's experiences online and begin to answer some of the common questions that you might have about your child's tech use. Some of these questions include, should I be worried about my child's screen time? How does tech use, including smartphones and social media use and other things, affect mental health? And what does healthy or unhealthy tech use look like? What are the benefits and the risks of engaging with technology? In terms of learning objectives, by the end of this webinar, you should be able to describe the role of the developmental context in youth technology use, identify some of the benefits and the risks of technology use, define that healthy and unhealthy tech use, and describe ways to support your child's healthy relationship with technology. So let's jump in. But before we talk about what healthy tech use really looks like, we need to consider the developmental context. Where kids are at developmentally, that means their cognitive, social, emotional level, will play an important role in determining what they are drawn to do in an online setting and in helping us understand what it is that they're doing online and how that feeds into what we might consider healthy or adaptive behaviors. In childhood, technology use is typically parent controlled, with a really large focus on entertainment and on learning. Kids are engaging primarily with technology to play games or to watch videos, and they tend to do this alongside parents. At this age, kids want to share everything that they're doing and seeing online with their parents. And this makes sense because developmentally, children are very oriented towards their parents and they look to them as primary sources of connection, support, and guidance. As kids start to enter adolescence and become more autonomous from their parents, their social needs become much more important, and what they do online shifts accordingly. This is when we start to see kids push for more time online and more resistance to having that time monitored. Younger teens, ages 10 to 13, are still interested in entertainment, but their social needs are becoming more important. So while they still might be deeply into playing video games, they will start to be drawn to multi-user games, where there's an opportunity to socialize with their peers while they're playing. This is also the age that we see kids become more interested in social media, like Snapchat, to connect with their friends online. Importantly, at this point, young teens are focused on the quantity of their friendships and less so on the quality. It's very much about popularity. For example, you might see young teens wanting to have the highest number of followers or the longest streak on Snapchat. In older adolescents, ages 14 to 18, teens become much more focused on developing close friendships and often experience their first intimate romantic relationships. The goal for them at this age is really quality. They move from the more superficial goals of having a lot of friends to wanting to know one other person deeply and sharing everything with that person. A lot of the time that they spend online in older adolescents is spent in one-on-one conversations through text or videos. This shift from a focus on tech for entertainment and co-viewing with parents to a more autonomous, independent use of technology coincides with an important developmental shift that occurs as youth enter adolescence. Indeed, the transition to adolescence is accompanied by important developmental social goals to establish supportive peer relationships. And this is what prepares adolescents for their future life as an independent adult. So at this age, we see that kids begin to focus their attention on building relationships outside of the family, which again is an important developmental milestone to ensure their success as adults. In the midst of these changing parental relationships, we see that peers become important sources for intimacy, for feedback about social behavior, for social influence, and for social and emotional support. And so while parents continue to be an important source of support and protection in adolescence, they begin to share this significance with peers. And understanding this developmental context is important because it helps us understand why adolescents are so oriented towards their devices. This is where their friends are. In this way, when we understand the developmental context, we can begin to understand why youth are turning to go online and engage with technology. And when we have this context, it can help us communicate with them about their technology use in an effective way that supports finding a balance with technology use. It can also help us understand what healthy tech use might look like, since meeting developmental needs online can actually contribute to positive outcomes and well-being. So let's dig into this a bit more. what is healthy technology use? Here, I bet a lot of you would love for me to give you a number of hours or a list of healthy and unhealthy activities, but unfortunately, it's a lot more complex than that. Healthy tech use can look different for different children based on their needs, their vulnerabilities, and their developmental context. That said, we can think of healthy use in terms of its outcomes. What is the impact of the technology use on children's development and on children's well-being? When we think about it this way, healthy use can be any use that contributes to positive development and well-being. This means that healthy use will likely vary across development and across children. So let's take a closer look at what this might look like across development. In childhood, we see that positive outcomes from technology use are largely centered around learning and entertainment and can include things like learning about the world through watching videos or reading. It can also include developing digital literacy skills through engaging with technology alongside parents and caregivers. Through doing this kind of engagement alongside parents and caregivers, children can actually begin to acquire important skills about how to use technology in safe and effective ways. This can also include how to decipher information and distinguish between reliable sources and misinformation. It can also include how to engage with the digital world in a responsible and ethical way, as well as more technical skills like how to use different softwares. Also, in childhood, we see that technology use can be used to help support children in exploring their creativity through the use of various games and apps. And they can also acquire important problem-solving skills through engaging in this type of activity. And of course, as I'm sure you know, technology use can contribute to developing children's communication and social skills as they learn to communicate with their family and their friends in online settings. When we move to looking at what this might look like in adolescence, in addition to the benefits that we see in childhood, we see a larger focus on developmental goals that align with what teens are doing online. So specifically, online engagement can actually help contribute towards adolescents' developmental goals for autonomy, identity development, and social connection. So let's break this down a bit further. One of the important ways in which smartphone and social media engagement can contribute to adolescents' positive development and their well-being is through providing them with a sense of autonomy. So as youth enter adolescence, they have a developmental need for autonomy that's characterized by a need to feel a sense of agency, a sense of control, and a sense of volition over their actions as they become more independent from their parents and their caregivers. So as this transition happens, teens have a need to feel that they have control and choice over their lives. And it turns out that smartphones and social media can provide an important avenue for youth to meet this developmental goal through providing them with an opportunity to experience a sense of agency, choice, and volition in how they're presenting themselves online, in what content they're sharing, and the choice of with whom they wish to connect, as well as what they want to read, listen to, and watch. So these technologies can provide important opportunities for youth to explore their emerging identities as well by allowing them to learn about diverse others in online settings, allowing them opportunities to connect with like-minded people, and providing them with opportunities to creatively express themselves online. So it's really important to consider that when we're in that online context, this context is asynchronous. So the asynchronous nature of social media actually provides adolescents with a unique opportunity to really carefully construct and curate how they're presenting themselves and choose with whom they're sharing that presentation of their identity. So in this way, social media affords youth with a sense of agency over which aspects of their emerging identities they wish to share and with whom. So for example, there's been some research that's found that some teens have multiple social media profiles intended for different audiences. They might have one for their parents and one for their friends. And in this way, social media is providing them with an opportunity to try out different aspects of their identities and gain feedback from their peers on how those are being received. As adolescents begin to focus more on their peer relationships, their need for social connection is also heightened. So, while all humans have this fundamental need for social connection and belonging, in adolescence, this need is amplified by their developmentally rooted social goals. What this means is that in adolescence, this basic human need for social connection coincides with their developmental need to feel accepted and connected with their peers. And this is important because it's the satisfaction of these developmental social needs that allows teens to grow up healthy, happy, and well adjusted. And sure enough, there's decades of research to support the idea that when these developmental social goals aren't met, teens become more at risk for maladaptive outcomes such as developing mental health issues, dropping out of school, struggling with substance use, acts of aggression and defiance, and the list goes on. So clearly, these social needs are extremely important in adolescence for their healthy development and their overall well-being. So when we think about adolescents' tech engagement, youth might be turning to smartphones and social media to satisfy their need for connection, since these different technologies provide them with opportunities to feel more connected to others and to foster intimacy and friendship. And indeed, recent work indicates that the desire to feel more connected to others is one of the key drivers of adolescents' tech use. And this might be particularly true for those who lack a sense of relatedness and belonging in their offline lives, such as minority youth who might not see their identities reflected in their direct peer groups or communities. And they might struggle to find a sense of relatedness and connection in their daily lives as a result of that. For these youth, social media and technology can provide them with an opportunity to connect with similar youth in a broader network and see these aspects of their emerging identities reflected back at them, providing them with that sense of belonging that's so important at this age. So, we've discussed several adaptive uses of technology that we can consider healthy as they contribute to youth's positive development and well being and help them meet their different developmental goals. But what about that unhealthy use? What does this actually look like? If healthy use is the use that contributes to positive development and well being, then unhealthy use is the use that contributes to negative outcomes and ill being. And I know, again, it would be great if we could just categorize certain types of technology use as bad, or if I could give you a magic number of how many hours on screens are healthy or good. But the truth is that it's much more complicated than that. And the answer is not one size fits all. So let's unpack that a bit. A lot of the conversation on negative impacts of technology use has focused on the impact of technology use on mental health. One of the key reasons for this is that research in recent years has found a concerning increase in teenage depression and anxiety, and that this increase has occurred alongside the widespread adoption of social media and smartphones. And since these two phenomena have emerged together, the simple, common sense answer might be to assume that one causes the other. And sure enough, the co-occurrence of these two phenomena have led many, including some psychologists, to conclude that the technology must be responsible for the increase in teenage anxiety and depression. But we have to be careful when we make such claims. Just because there is an association or a relationship between technology use and mental health, that there is a causal link. What that means is just because these two phenomena have co-occurred does not mean that one causes the other. Some of you may have heard the phrase correlation does not imply causation before, and that's exactly what we need to look out for here. Specifically, while we know that there is a relationship between technology use and mental health, with many studies finding correlations or associations between the amount of time that teens are spending online or on social media and their experiences of depression and anxiety, What remains unclear is whether one actually causes the other, which is a classic problem with correlational research that looks specifically at the relationship between two things at one time point. While it is possible that tech use is contributing to negative mental health, it is equally possible that depression and anxiety are contributing to increased time on screens. It's also possible that a third variable, a third factor, is responsible for the increase that we're seeing in both technology engagement and mental health. And this was clearly the case during the COVID-19 pandemic, where teens were spending much more time on screens due to physical distancing guidelines and simultaneously experiencing increased mental health concerns due to social distancing and being separated from their peers. Similarly, a third factor like cyberbullying or sleep may be responsible for the relationship that we see between technology engagement and mental health. In other words, the time that teens are spending online might negatively contribute to their mental health, specifically when they're experiencing cyberbullying or when that technology use is interfering with their sleep. Currently, research into the causal relationship between technology use and mental health is mixed. What this means is that when we look beyond the relationship between these two things into whether one is actually causing the other, the findings are inconsistent. Some studies find a small effect of technology use on mental health. And within these studies, there seems to be more evidence for a stronger effect for social media use on depression specifically. And some studies suggest that girls might be at higher risk. That said, other studies find no relationship, or they even find the inverse relationship, where negative experiences of mental health are contributing to increased engagement with technology. In these cases, it's hypothesized that teens with depression or anxiety might be turning to screens to help them cope with some of their negative feelings. Because of this, research is moving away from looking at the direct effect of technology on mental health and instead looking to unpack the different psychological experiences that are occurring online that might be contributing to negative experiences of mental health. In other words, the research is moving away from this idea that the tech itself is bad to looking to understand youth's experiences online and how these are contributing to their well-being. One of the main reasons that research has moved away from this main effects model is that there's an understanding that attributing a rise in mental health concerns to tech use is an oversimplification. We know that not one stressor is likely the cause of depression or anxiety, but rather that these experiences result from the interaction of many different things. So, in this way, we need to consider what kids are doing online, and maybe more importantly, how they're feeling about those experiences and their unique pre existing vulnerabilities. We need to consider all of these different elements when we start to think about how the technology might be contributing to their ill being. For example, we could have two teens using social media for exactly the same amount of time, but with vastly different outcomes as a result of the way that they're using it and how it's making them feel. And this is where parents and caregivers can play a really pivotal role by helping youth understand how their technology use is impacting their well being. How is it making them feel? So, we want to think about what kinds of pre existing vulnerabilities might be contributing to youth's negative experiences online, which in turn might be negatively impacting their mental health and well being. And of course, there has been a lot of research that's showed that youth with pre existing mental health concerns are those that are most at risk of suffering negative impacts of technology use on their subsequent mental health. But if we move beyond thinking about mental health as a pre-existing vulnerability, we also want to consider what other types of psychological vulnerabilities might be heightened in online contexts and negatively contribute to mental health when teens are engaging in online spaces. And sure enough, research has begun to identify some pretty notable risks in this area. And these include social comparison, cyberbullying, and the fear of missing out, or FOMO. What's important to note here is that all three of these experiences are likely to be even more heightened in adolescence as they align with teens' developmental social goals. So, teens might be particularly vulnerable to these psychological experiences, which could be negatively contributing to their mental health. So let's break this down a bit more. First, social comparison is the act of comparing oneself to others. In adolescence, this is a very typical behavior as it provides youth with information about how they are doing relative to their peers. In the online context, social media provides a heightened arena for social comparison with others. And importantly, people tend to present embellished versions of themselves online. So these social comparisons are often much harsher than warranted, and this can negatively contribute to teens' well-being as they perceive themselves to be consistently inferior to these embellished versions of their peers. In terms of cyberbullying, research has found that both youth who engage in cyberbullying and or are the victim of cyberbullying are more likely to experience depression and anxiety. Unlike traditional bullying, cyberbullying can be relived anywhere and anytime. So, if teen screen time is characterized by these experiences, it could be negatively contributing to their overall well being. For example, if your teen is using their phone to reread hurtful comments or watch an embarrassing video, this could be an example of an unhealthy use of technology that's negatively impacting their well being. Lastly, FOMO, or the fear of missing out, is defined as the pervasive apprehension that others might be having rewarding experiences from which one is absent, and it has been associated with worse experiences of mental health. Similar to social and cyberbullying, FOMO can be intensified by smartphone and social media use as it provides an avenue for youth to be more consistently aware of what others are up to and thus what they might be missing out on. Importantly, FOMO can be seen as a developmentally adaptive response in adolescence. So it's actually developmentally normative for teens to worry about how they're fitting in with their peer groups and whether or not they're being included in key social activities. But social media can amplify these concerns by providing an avenue for youth to compulsively check in on their peers. They have consistent information about what others are up to. And this can make it such that experiencing FOMO leads teens to engage more technology use to check in on what others are doing, which can actually lead them to feeling more left out if they become aware of things that they weren't included in, which can lead them to engaging with technology more to keep checking in on what others are doing, which can lead them to feeling more left out in this kind of vicious cycle. And sure enough, in a recent study that I conducted with my colleagues at the University of British Columbia, we actually found that FOMO was a really strong predictor of problematic technology use among teens in BC. And in another study that we conducted during the pandemic, we found that FOMO was the strongest predictor of teens' feelings of social disconnection. So when we take these findings together, we can really see that the fear of missing out, or FOMO, is a really important risk factor for understanding teens' online experiences and how these are impacting their mental health. So now that we've unpacked the impact of technology use on mental health and we've identified some key risk factors, what can we do about these? How can we address and minimize these risk factors? When it comes to cyberbullying and pre-existing mental health concerns, parents, caregivers, and schools have an important role to play. It's important that caregivers and schools openly communicate about how teens are doing and that everybody is paying attention. This means regularly checking in with youth and recognizing when something is off, noticing changes in behavior and questioning them. Of course, we know adolescence can be a very turbulent time, so behavior changes and mood swings are expected. But you know your kids best. Are they just in a slump, or is it something more than that? Be attentive, check in, and importantly, be available when they want to talk and offer appropriate supports. This again is where relationships with schools come in as being really important because schools can provide great resources for support as well. In terms of sleep, we know that tech use can contribute to sleep disruptions and that poor sleep is a very strong predictor of negative mental health. So, how can we help mitigate these risks? You might want to consider something like limiting access to technology in bedrooms at nighttime and before bed. Some research has even found that we shouldn't be on screens for an hour before going to sleep because this can actually disrupt sleep patterns. We know that getting enough sleep is one of the biggest protectors for mental health. So you might want to think about how you can protect your children's sleep when navigating how they're engaging with technology. In terms of social comparison and FOMO, it's important to get youth to think critically about the time that they're spending online and how it's making them feel. Talk to teens about what they're doing online and how they feel during and after spending time on screens. Get them to question what they're seeing online, whether it's realistic, who it was created for, who it was created by, and encourage youth to be intentional in their technology engagement and to consider their motivations for going online and what it is that they're getting out of it. Encourage them to ask themselves questions like, what am I getting out of this interaction? What is the benefit of this? How do I feel afterwards? To empower them to make informed choices about what to engage with and when to engage. This will help them build important skills that they can use to foster healthy technology habits across their lifespans. So, moving beyond specific risk factors, how can we support healthy relationships with technology? As a first step, we can offer developmentally appropriate supports. So, thinking back to the beginning of my presentation, we talked about the importance of the developmental context and how this influences what kids and teens are doing online. Offering developmentally appropriate supports means thinking about what kids are doing online and how this might contribute to their developmental needs when guiding them in how they're using technology. So for younger children, this might look like co-viewing and engaging with technology together. And as youth move towards adolescence, it might involve providing them with more opportunities for autonomy in how they're navigating their technology use. The next step of this is to establish clear guidelines and boundaries around technology use. That again, always consider the developmental context. So a good way to do this is through developing a family tech plan, and the Kelty Mental Health website has a great resource for this that will be shared with you all in the chat. But throughout all of this, it's important that parents and caregivers also act as positive role models. This means that you need to model healthy tech habits yourself. So you need to demonstrate to youth and the children in your life how to use these technologies responsibly, respectfully, and in moderation. And you need to be open about your own struggles in your relationship with technology and share your own tips for how you're dealing with those. For example, maybe you notice sometimes you spend too much time on social media, so you take a break when it's needed. That could be a great example of modeling a healthy coping habit with your teens. Lastly, you can open up an ongoing dialogue around technology use that really promotes critical thinking. This means regularly sharing and inviting youth to share their experiences, their concerns, and their interests related to technology use, and encouraging critical thinking around how technology is making them feel. So, I just want to spend a few more minutes talking about the family tech plan. I think this is a really great practical step that we can all leave here with today. So I'd like to emphasize some important considerations for when you're developing this tech plan. First of all, it's important, and I've said this many times, so I'm sure you are all very familiar with what I'm going to say next, but it's important that we consider the developmental context when we're developing a family tech plan. So what this means is that, for example, for younger kids, this plan might be more parent-led or parent initiative. But for teens, this plan can be created in a much more collaborative way. If you empower teens to reflect on their own relationships with technology and ask them what kinds of boundaries they would like to see in your household, you'll be getting their buy-in right from the start. Second, it's important that everyone in your household agree on the boundaries and time restraints if you put those in place. So, whatever this looks like for your family, you have to make sure that these guidelines are clear and that everybody in the family equally agrees on them. This also means you as the adults. So you might want to consider things like, do your guidelines apply to everyone in the family equally, or are there exceptions? And make sure that everybody in the household understands and agrees on these. For example, maybe mom is allowed to have her phone out during game night in case she gets a work email, but everybody else must have their devices put away. If that was a rule that you would develop in your household, you would want to have a conversation around that, make sure everyone agrees and understands why that is put in place in that way. You also want to make sure that tech-free times and zones are clear and consistent. If you begin to make too many exceptions, the agreement will lose its value. That said, it's also important to be adaptive. The technology landscape is constantly changing and evolving, and so are our lives with technology. So it's important that you stay relevant with your family tech plan and revisit it often. This should be an ongoing conversation to ensure that your plan is still meeting the needs of your family. So I'd just like to end here by sharing a few resources. The first is the Kelty Mental Health website. They have a section specifically called Tech in Check. This is a great resource for practical tips on how to navigate healthy technology use in childhood and adolescence. So I encourage all of you to check it out if you haven't done so already. The second is the Children's Screen Time Action Network, which is a website full of resources on children and teen tech use. And I specifically want to highlight one of these resources, which is a guide that was created by teens for parents, and it's called Dear Parents. This is truly an excellent resource full of tips, tricks, and insights from teens on how to best support them in their screen time and technology use. It also has some great suggestions on how to start that conversation around maybe developing a family tech plan. So I encourage you to check that out as well. The first that I want to share is Media Smarts, which is a Canadian not-for-profit organization. They have a ton of great resources on digital and media literacy for kids and teens. And so I also encourage you to check that one out.
Thank you so much, Dr. Parent. That was such an interesting presentation, and you've shared so many helpful insights and strategies for promoting healthy tech use for parents and caregivers watching today. So thank you so much. And with approximately 15 minutes left, we will now open up the Q&A portion of the webinar. So just a reminder, if you have questions for Dr. Parent, please submit them through the Q&A icon. And you can also upvote questions that you want to be answered. So I'll go ahead and start reading some of the questions that we've gotten so far. So first question, can you please address concerns about industry influence on children and youth through screen time? For example, algorithms that reinforce continual scrolling and keep eyes on screens, exposure to unhealthy food marketing, sedentary behavior, and lack of physical activity and social connectivity in person.
Yeah, thank you so much for this question. I think that this is a really important thing to consider, given our context, where so much of what teens and children are doing online is actually being directly impacted by the different organizations that run these different social media platforms and whatnot. I'm not going to comment directly on the industry piece of it, but instead I can speak to this from the perspective of developmental psychology and what we can be doing to empower teens in these spaces. So what I would say in response to this is that this is where we really need to be teaching children and youth media literacy skills. We need to be having conversations with them so that they're aware of these different pieces and how it's affecting their engagement with the technology. One of the things on the comment of algorithms is that many of these different social media platforms now actually provide opportunities for teens to actually shape the algorithm and have more control over what content it is that they're viewing and consuming as part of their social media engagement. And so I would encourage conversations around that with youth and get them to think critically about what it is that they're seeing and what the impact is of that. And then encouraging them to really curate their feeds so that it's actually meeting their needs in positive ways.
Thank you, Dr. Parent. The next question is, can you share any research on the increased dopamine associated with screen use and its implications on brain health under the age of 25 as the brain is forming?
Yeah, great question as well. Again, I mean, you can think about, I'm not a neuroscientist and that's not my area of expertise. So I'll just preface this answer with that. However, we do know that engaging with social media can activate the reward system in the brain, which is linked to that dopamine response. And through that reward activation, there is some literature that suggests that we're creating stronger habits in engaging with those different platforms and technologies. So when youth are engaging with online platforms, that activates their reward system, which reinforces that habit creation with those online platforms. This is again why I'm going to bring it back to what I was saying before. What I think is important for us here is we really need to be teaching kids to think critically about how their time online is making them feel. Because if it's just a matter of that dopamine response, that's a short-lived kind of high that then goes away. And so is that actually meeting a deeper need for them, or are they just kind of doing it as a quick fix and that dopamine high would go away over time as well? So just something to consider for youth.
Thank you, Dr. Parent. Another question, considering what you know about youth and technology, what guidelines or recommendations do you think are most important to set during early and middle childhood as a foundation for healthy screen use throughout the older years?
Yeah, this is a really great question as well. So I think that it's really important that we consider the developmental context. And I think this question is really rooted in that piece. So for younger children, we want to be starting those conversations really young because younger children want to be engaged in co-viewing. They want to engage in technology use with parents and caregivers. And so you have a really great opportunity there to start the conversation around media literacy, around how is the technology making you feel. And so I think that there's a great opportunity to start talking about some of these concerns that we see emerging in adolescence at the younger years in order to get kids to already begin thinking about these pieces and scaffolding some of those skills that they might need later on. In terms of more specific guidelines, I think that it is child and family specific, but you want to make sure that you have a family technology plan for younger children that suits your lifestyle and the needs of your family.
Thank you, Dr. Parent. The next question is, for kids who are vulnerable and are looking for connection online, how do we keep them safe apart from conversations? Because sometimes, despite the conversations and openness, teens still get into risky situations online.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, here I think I would pull this back to just remembering that this is just a new context, right? So teens have always been putting themselves in risky situations. It's kind of a normative developmental part of being an adolescent. Of course, as parents and caregivers, we want to protect them as much as we can, but this is just the truth of being in that age. So I know the question specifically said, don't bring it back to conversations, but I will because that's really where you have that power. So if you have an open communication with your teens, then they will come to you when something doesn't feel right. So you want to be making sure that you're setting them up for success in terms of, do they have the skills to navigate a new situation and do they know where to turn for help when they need it?
Thank you, Dr. Parent. The next question is, I'm curious to know if there's been any link found between excessive screen time and a lack or decrease in social skills in person. Are people or kids forgetting how to socialize face to face? So much of it is done on screens.
Yeah, so I can speak to this question with some of the research that I did with my colleagues at the University of British Columbia during the pandemic, because we kind of had a little bit of a natural experiment there wherein kids were forced to interact only online and not in person. And we collected some qualitative data as part of this study where we asked children to describe how they were getting along and connecting with others in the time of COVID-19. And so they described in their own words to us what that was looking like. And what we saw in that data was that there was a little bit of an uncertainty on how to navigate those in-person situations at the beginning, but that they bounced back. So we did see that when kids were forced to only interact online, some of them did struggle when they went back to classrooms, and some of them actually chose to hide behind masks because it felt like a kind of a safety net for them because they weren't used to being face to face, sorry. But we did see that that actually disappeared over time. So to answer the question more broadly, I think that when kids are also interacting in those in-person places, they don't tend to, it doesn't seem to have an effect that they forget how to interact online. And if it does, then they easily bounce back and remember it. That said, there are some teens who might be more at risk for that type of social isolation, I guess, like only interacting online and being timid in in-person situations. And that's where we've done some work on shyness that relates to that. So we do actually see that adolescents that are higher in shyness might be more likely to just kind of only want to interact online and remove themselves from those social situations. So I think in those cases, it's really important to make sure that teens are still getting that face-to-face contact, even when for some of them it's uncomfortable.
Thank you, Dr. Parent. And with just about 5 minutes left, I'd like to wrap things up. Very, very sincere thank you to Dr. Natasha Parent for being here today and for connecting with our webinar audience. You gave such an informative presentation and we really appreciate it. Also, thank you to our participants who made time to join us today in the webinar. And thank you to my colleagues as well who have been working hard behind the scenes to make sure that the webinar goes smoothly. Please contact us if you had any other questions that didn't get answered. Email or call toll free from anywhere in BC. Our email and phone number are on the screen, and both the email and phone number will allow you to connect with our family peer support workers. You can also find more information about tech use at keltymentalhealth.ca/tech-in-check. And this will also be added in the chat, and this has been added in the chat earlier as well. And lastly, a recording of this webinar will be uploaded to the Kelty website, and it will also be emailed to you. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.